The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Montana, as Flora Redwood pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild stallion. She had nowhere left to run, no place left to hide, and as she clutched the small leather pouch containing the last of her savings, she knew with devastating certainty that her journey west had been a terrible mistake. The year was 1875, and for a 22-year-old woman alone on the frontier, hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Flora wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her once fair features. 6 months ago, she had boarded a train in Boston with dreams of starting anew, of escaping the suffocating expectations of her family and the heartbreak of a broken engagement. The advertisement had promised opportunity and independence for a young woman willing to work as a schoolteacher in the growing town of Willow Creek. What it hadn't mentioned was the dilapidated schoolhouse that had burned down 3 months before her arrival, or the town council's sudden lack of funds to rebuild it. "Miss Redwood," a gruff voice called out, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the wooden boardwalk. "I know you're around here somewhere. You can't hide from me forever." It was Mr. Hollister, the owner of the boarding house where she'd been staying. She was 2 weeks behind on her rent, and his patience had run out. Flora pressed herself deeper into the shadows, hoping the gathering dusk would conceal her position. "I warned you fair and square," Hollister continued, his voice getting closer. "No money, no room. And I'm keeping that trunk of yours until you pay what you owe." Flora closed her eyes, fighting back tears of frustration. Everything she owned was in that trunk: her clothes, her books, the photograph of her parents, and the silver locket her grandmother had given her before she died. All she had left were the clothes on her back and the pitiful amount of coins in her pouch, not even enough for a ticket back east. "Excuse me, sir." A deep, unfamiliar voice interrupted Hollister's shouting. "Might I inquire what all this commotion is about?" Flora peered around the corner of the building, curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. A tall man stood with his back to her, facing Hollister. Even in the fading light, she could see he cut an impressive figure broad-shouldered, with a cowboy hat set at an angle on his head, and a confident stance that suggested he was not a man easily intimidated. "This ain't your business, Turner," Hollister spat. "I'm looking for a tenant who's behind on her payments." "I see," the stranger Turner replied calmly. "And does hunting down a young woman in the streets at dusk strike you as gentlemanly behavior?" Hollister's face reddened. "What I do with my tenants is my affair." "Perhaps," Turner said, his voice still even but with an edge of steel beneath it. "But I find myself taking an interest nonetheless. How much does the lady owe you?" Flora gasped softly. What was this stranger doing? She shrank back into the shadows as Hollister named the sum, an amount that represented nearly 2 months of a schoolteacher's salary. Without hesitation, the cowboy reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small fold of bills. "I believe this should cover her debt, with something extra for your trouble." Hollister eyed the money greedily, then snatched it from the man's hand. "Fine. Her things are at my establishment. You can collect them whenever you like." With a final suspicious glance around the street, he stomped away, leaving Flora staring in astonishment at her unexpected benefactor. For a long moment she remained hidden, uncertain what to do. The man hadn't moved, and as she watched, he turned slowly in her direction. "You can come out now, miss," he called softly. "Hollister's gone, and I promise I mean you no harm." Flora hesitated, clutching her pouch tighter. In Boston, she would never have considered revealing herself to a strange man, but this wasn't Boston, and she was desperate. Gathering what remained of her courage, she stepped out from the shadows. The man's eyes widened slightly as she emerged, and Flora was suddenly, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her once fine blue dress now dusty and worn, her hair falling loose from its pins, and her face dirty from her day spent wandering the town in search of work. "Thank you for your intervention, sir," she said, striving to maintain what dignity she could. "But I'm afraid I have no means to repay your kindness." The cowboy removed his hat, revealing a face younger than she had expected, perhaps no more than 30, with striking features and the most remarkable pair of green eyes she had ever seen. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jawline. "Quincy Turner," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "And there's no need for repayment, Miss Redwood," she supplied cautiously. "Flora Redwood." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Redwood, a pleasure to make your acquaintance, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He gestured toward the main street. "Might I escort you somewhere? To family or friends, perhaps?" Flora shook her head, feeling the weight of her situation settle even more heavily on her shoulders. "I have neither in Willow Creek, Mr. Turner. I came to be the town schoolteacher, only to discover upon arrival that there is no school." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Ah, yes, the fire. I heard about that when I arrived last week." He studied her for a moment, seeming to come to a decision. "Miss Redwood, I own a small ranch just outside of town. My housekeeper, Mrs. Whitaker, is in need of assistance, and I find myself in want of someone who might help educate the children of my ranch hands. Would such a position interest you?" Flora stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate hope. "Why would you offer employment to a complete stranger?" Quincy Turner's smile deepened, revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. "Let's just say I recognize a fellow soul who's had their share of setbacks." He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "The offer stands, but I understand your caution. If you're interested, I'll be at the general store tomorrow morning at 10. Mrs. Whitaker will accompany me, and you can speak with her yourself." With that, he gave her a respectful nod and turned to leave. "Mr. Turner," Flora called after him, causing him to pause and look back. "My trunk at Mr. Hollister's will be delivered to wherever you're staying tonight," he finished for her. "Where might that be?" Flora's face flushed with embarrassment. I don't know yet." Something flickered in his eyes. Not pity, which she would have detested, but a kind of understanding that made her heart constrict strangely. "The widow Simmons runs a respectable boarding house on Cedar Street," he said. "Tell her Quincy Turner sent you, and that I'll settle your bill in the morning." Before Flora could protest, he was striding away down the street, his long legs carrying him quickly into the gathering darkness. She stood there for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. A week ago, she had been on the verge of writing to her parents, begging for enough money to return to Boston. Pride had stopped her then. Pride, and the knowledge that her return would be viewed as confirmation of what everyone had told her, that a young woman had no business striking out on her own. Now she found herself with an unexpected opportunity, offered by a man she didn't know, for reasons she couldn't fathom. It could be a trap, she reasoned. He could have unsavory intentions. And yet, something about Quincy Turner had inspired trust. Perhaps it was the respect with which he had treated her, or the lack of judgment in his gaze when he saw her bedraggled state. As the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Flora made her decision. She would go to the widow Simmons's boarding house tonight, and tomorrow morning she would meet Quincy Turner at the general store. She would hear what he and his housekeeper had to say, and then she would decide. For the first time in weeks, a small flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Flora didn't trust it yet, couldn't afford to let it grow too bright, but as she set off toward Cedar Street, she allowed herself to think that perhaps, just perhaps, her luck was about to change. The widow Simmons's boarding house was a two-story structure painted a cheerful yellow, with neat white trim and a well-tended garden that set it apart from the more utilitarian buildings in Willow Creek. Flora hesitated at the gate, second-guessing her decision, but the memory of Quincy Turner's kind eyes gave her the courage to continue up the path and knock on the front door. The woman who answered was perhaps in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a tidy bun and sharp eyes that assessed Flora with a single glance. "Yes?" she inquired, her tone neither welcoming nor dismissive. "Good evening," Flora said, straightening her posture and attempting to appear more composed than she felt. "My name is Flora Redwood. Mr. Quincy Turner suggested I might find lodging here for the night." The mention of Turner's name worked an immediate transformation. The widow's face softened, and she opened the door wider. "Any friend of Mr. Turner's is welcome here," she said, ushering Flora inside. "He's a good man, that one. Helped my son repair the roof last month, and wouldn't take a penny for it." The interior of the house was as neat and well-kept as its exterior, with polished wood floors and simple but quality furnishings. The smell of fresh bread and something savory stew perhaps filled the air, reminding Flora that she hadn't eaten since early morning. "Mr. Turner mentioned he would settle my bill tomorrow," Flora explained, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. "I hope that's acceptable." "More than acceptable," Mrs. Simmons assured her. "If Quincy Turner vouches for you, that's good enough for me." She gave Flora another appraising look, this one more sympathetic. "Looks like you've had a rough time of it, dear. Why don't you come into the kitchen? Dinner's just about ready, and there's plenty to go around." Before Flora could respond, the front door opened, and two men entered carrying her trunk. "Delivery for Miss Redwood," one of them announced. "Compliments of Mr. Turner." Mrs. Simmons directed them to take the trunk upstairs to the spare room at the end of the hall, then turned back to Flora with raised eyebrows. "Seems like you've made quite an impression on our Mr. Turner." "We only just met," Flora hastened to explain. "He intervened when Mr. Hollister was expressing his displeasure about my overdue rent. Mr. Turner paid my debt and offered me a position at his ranch." "Did he now?" Mrs. Simmons looked intrigued rather than alarmed. "Well, if it's a position at the Turner Ranch, you'd be wise to consider it. It's a growing operation, and from what I hear, he treats his people well." She gestured toward the back of the house. "Come along now. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good night's rest." Flora followed, her mind whirling with questions. Who was Quincy Turner really? Why had he taken such an interest in her welfare? And what would tomorrow bring? The kitchen was warm and inviting, with copper pots hanging from a rack, and a large table where several other boarders were already seated. Mrs. Simmons introduced Flora, offering a simplified version of her circumstances that preserved her dignity, for which Flora was profoundly grateful. As she ate the most satisfying meal she'd had in weeks, Flora listened to the conversation flow around her. Much of it centered on local happenings, but when one of the boarders, a traveling salesman named Peterson, mentioned Turner Ranch, Flora's attention sharpened. "Heard he's expanding again," Peterson was saying. "Bought the old Decker place last month and is already making improvements. Man's got vision, I'll give him that. And the means to make it happen," added another boarder, an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Judge Hawkins, retired. "Not many men come west with that kind of capital." "Where did Mr. Turner come from?" Flora found herself asking. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face grow warm under their scrutiny. "St. Louis, originally," Judge Hawkins replied after a moment. "Though I understand he spent some time in California before settling here. He arrived about 3 years ago, bought a struggling cattle operation, and has been building it up ever since." "Smart businessman," Peterson contributed. "But fair. Pays top dollar for quality goods and expects quality in return. And generous to a fault," Mrs. Simmons added. When the Wilsons lost their farm to that fire last summer, it was Quincy Turner who helped them rebuild. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Flora's thoughts remained fixed on the enigmatic cowboy who had come to her rescue. By all accounts, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a successful rancher with a kind heart. Yet Flora had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Her former fiancé, Charles Wentworth, had seemed the perfect gentleman until she discovered his gambling debts and the fact that he viewed her primarily as a means to access her father's wealth. After dinner, Mrs. Simmons showed Flora to her room, a small but comfortable space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the garden. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, a tangible reminder of Quincy Turner's intervention. Once alone, Flora opened the trunk, relieved to find its contents undisturbed. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face and hands in the basin, and then sat on the edge of the bed, contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. For the past month, she had been sinking deeper into despair, watching her savings dwindle and her prospects dim. She had come west full of determination to prove her independence, to show her family and herself that she could make her own way in the world. Instead, she had found herself on the verge of destitution, with no choice but to admit defeat and crawl back to Boston in disgrace. And then, like a character from one of the dime novels she secretly enjoyed, Quincy Turner had appeared, offering not just immediate aid but a potential future. It seemed too good to be true, which was precisely why Flora couldn't fully trust it. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house settling for the night, Flora made a promise to herself. She would meet with Turner and his housekeeper tomorrow. She would listen to what they had to say, but she would not let desperation cloud her judgment. If there was anything suspicious about the offer, she would decline it and find another solution to her problems. With that resolution firm in her mind, Flora closed her eyes, surprised to find that despite her caution, the small flame of hope that had sparked earlier had not been extinguished. If anything, it burned a little brighter. The morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air despite it being only late August. Flora woke early, refreshed by the first good night's sleep she'd had in weeks. She dressed carefully in the best of her remaining clothes, a dark green walking dress that complemented her auburn hair and hazel eyes, and pinned her hair in a neat but simple style. Mrs. Simmons provided a hearty breakfast and, to Flora's relief, asked no further questions about her arrangement with Quincy Turner. At 9:30, Flora thanked her hostess and set out for the general store, her pulse quickening with each step. Willow Creek's general store occupied a prime position on Main Street, its wide front porch offering a view of much of the town. As Flora approached, she saw Quincy Turner already waiting, engaged in conversation with a robust woman in her 60s. He spotted Flora almost immediately, his face lighting up with a smile that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Miss Redwood," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I'm pleased you decided to come." In the clear light of day, Flora could see him more distinctly than she had the previous evening. He was even more handsome than she had initially thought, with features that spoke of strength and character. Today, he was more formally dressed in a well-tailored suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, though he still had the unmistakable bearing of a man more at home on horseback than in town. "Mr. Turner," she acknowledged with a nod, then turned her attention to the older woman. "You must be Mrs. Whitaker." "Indeed I am," the housekeeper confirmed, studying Flora with keen blue eyes. "And you're the young lady Mr. Turner says might be our salvation." Flora raised an eyebrow at this description, glancing at Turner, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I may have mentioned that finding a qualified teacher for the children has been something of a challenge," he explained. "And that my poor old bones aren't what they used to be," Mrs. Whitaker added with a snort. "Though I'm not quite ready for the boneyard yet, despite what this one might think." The easy banter between them spoke of a comfortable, long-standing relationship, and Flora felt some of her tension ease. If this stern-looking but good-humored woman approved of Quincy Turner, perhaps her own instincts about him weren't far off. "Shall we go inside?" Turner suggested, gesturing toward the store. "Mr. Pemberton keeps a sitting area in the back, where we can talk more comfortably." The general store was busy with morning shoppers, but Turner led them confidently through the maze of barrels, shelves, and display cases to a small alcove furnished with a round table and several chairs. Once they were seated, he turned to Flora with an earnest expression. "Before we discuss the position, Miss Redwood, I want to assure you that your comfort and safety are paramount. The ranch house has a separate wing where you would have your own room, and Mrs. Whitaker's quarters are adjacent. The children you would be teaching are the sons and daughters of my ranch hands, ranging in age from 6 to 14. There are 7 of them at present, though that number may increase as I hire more workers. And they're good children for the most part," Mrs. Whitaker interjected. "Bit wild, as ranch children tend to be, but eager to learn. Their parents do what they can, but most have limited education themselves." Flora nodded, considering this information. "And what exactly would my duties entail?" "Primarily teaching," Turner replied. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, the usual subjects. The children would come to the ranch house 4 days a week for lessons. On the 5th day, I thought you might assist Mrs. Whitaker with household management, if you're amenable." "Which means keeping the accounts and correspondence in order," Mrs. Whitaker clarified. "My eyes aren't what they once were, and Mr. Turner's handwriting is atrocious." Turner's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. Mrs. Whitaker has never been one to mince words. "Life's too short for that nonsense," the housekeeper declared. "Miss Redwood, you should know that Turner Ranch is a decent place. The men respect Mr. Turner, and he doesn't tolerate any behavior that would make a lady uncomfortable. You'd be treated with proper regard." Flora looked between them, her mind working rapidly. The position sounded ideal, almost too ideal. "And the compensation?" she asked, determined to be practical. Turner named a figure that nearly made Flora gasp. It was substantially more than she would have earned as the town's schoolteacher. "That seems overly generous," she said cautiously. "Not at all," Turner countered. "I'm asking you to fulfill 2 roles, teacher and administrative assistant. Besides, I believe in paying for quality." He leaned forward slightly, his green eyes intent. "I understand your hesitation, Miss Redwood. You don't know me, and you've clearly had reason to be wary. I propose a trial period 1 month. If at the end of that time, you find the position unsuitable or uncomfortable in any way, I will personally ensure you have the means to return to Boston or to seek opportunity elsewhere." It was a fair offer, more than fair. And yet, Flora still hesitated, years of careful upbringing and recent disappointment making her cautious. "What brought you to Willow Creek, Mr. Turner?" she asked suddenly. "Judge Hawkins mentioned you came from St. Louis by way of California." If her abrupt change of subject surprised him, he didn't show it. "I came for the same reason many do: a fresh start. My father was a banker in St. Louis, and I was expected to follow in his footsteps. I tried, for his sake, but city life never suited me. After his death, I headed west, worked on several ranches in California to learn the business, then came here when I heard about land opening up." He smiled ruefully. "I suppose I was running away, in a sense, but I found something worth running toward." There was sincerity in his voice, an expression that Flora found difficult to doubt. She turned to Mrs. Whitaker. "And you, madam, how did you come to work for Mr. Turner?" The older woman's face softened. "My husband and I had a small farm outside of town. When he passed 5 years ago, I couldn't manage it alone. Mr. Turner bought the property but let me stay on in our house. When he realized I could cook better than the fellow he'd hired, He offered me the position of housekeeper. Been with him ever since. Flora nodded slowly, feeling the last of her reservations begin to dissolve. There was something about these two people, the straightforward older woman and the earnest cowboy with kind eyes, that inspired trust. And the practical reality was that she had few other options. "I accept your offer of a trial period, Mr. Turner," she said finally. "When would you like me to start?" The smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, bright and warming. "Excellent. Would tomorrow be too soon? I need to conclude some business in town today, but I could send a wagon for you in the morning." "Tomorrow would be fine," Flora agreed, finding herself returning his smile. "I don't have many possessions to transport." Then it's settled. Turner stood, offering his hand to help her rise. "Welcome to Turner Ranch, Miss Redwood." As Flora placed her hand in his, she was struck by the contrast, his palm large and calloused from physical labor, hers small and smooth, despite recent hardships. His grip was firm but gentle, and a curious warmth traveled up her arm at the contact. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Turner," she said, withdrawing her hand perhaps a bit too quickly. "I'll do my best to justify your faith in me." "I have no doubt of that," he replied, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary before he turned to Mrs. Whitaker. "Shall we see about securing Miss Redwood's supplies before we return to the ranch?" The next hour was spent selecting materials for her teaching duties: slates, primers, chalk, paper, and books. Turner insisted on purchasing everything of the highest quality available, waving away Flora's concerns about the expense. "Consider it an investment in the future of Turner Ranch," he said as Mr. Pemberton wrapped their purchases. "These children will one day help run the operation. The better educated they are, the more successful we'll all be." It was a pragmatic viewpoint, but Flora sensed there was more to it, a genuine concern for the welfare of the children under his care. This impression was reinforced when, as they were leaving the store, a small boy of about 8 ran up to Turner with a wide grin. "Mr. Turner, Pa said you might be in town today. Did you bring Thunderbolt?" The boy was practically bouncing with excitement. Turner chuckled, ruffling the child's hair. "Not today, Tommy, but I've brought someone you should meet." He turned to Flora. "Miss Redwood, this is Tommy Wilson. His father, Jack, is one of my ranch hands. Tommy, Miss Redwood is going to be your new teacher." The boy's eyes widened as he looked at Flora. "A real teacher? Like in a real school?" "That's right," Flora confirmed, charmed by his enthusiasm. "Do you enjoy learning, Tommy?" "Yes, madam. Pa's been teaching me my letters, but he says I need to learn proper to make something of myself." Tommy's face grew serious. "I want to be smart like Mr. Turner when I grow up." Flora glanced at Turner, surprised to see a hint of color rise in his face at the boy's admiration. "Well, I'll do my best to help you with that," she promised Tommy. After the boy had run off to share the news with his friends, Turner escorted Flora and Mrs. Whitaker back to the widow Simmons's boarding house. They agreed that the wagon would come for her at 9 the following morning, giving her time to prepare for the journey. As Turner and Mrs. Whitaker took their leave, the cowboy paused, turning back to Flora with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm glad you're coming to Turner Ranch, Miss Redwood," he said quietly. "I have a feeling you're going to bring something we've been missing." Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and strode away, leaving Flora with the strange sensation that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly anticipate. The journey to Turner Ranch took just over an hour, following a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with stands of pine and aspen. Flora sat beside the driver, a taciturn older man introduced as Hank, who unbent enough during the trip to point out landmarks and tell her a bit about the operation. "Mr. Turner runs about 500 head of cattle now," Hank informed her, his weathered face creasing with pride. "Started with less than 100, but he's got a good eye for breeding stock. Brought in some Herefords last year to cross with the Longhorns. Hardier animals? Better beef. Flora listened with interest, though much of the ranching terminology was foreign to her. What impressed her more was the evident respect in Hank's voice when he spoke of his employer. "Sounds like Mr. Turner has built something significant in a short time," she observed. Hank nodded. "Man works harder than anybody. Up before dawn, last to bed. Treats his people right, too. Fair wages, decent housing. My wife and we've worked other spreads where the owner barely knew your name. Not like that with Mr. Turner." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they crested a hill, and suddenly, Turner Ranch spread out before them. Flora caught her breath at the sight. Nestled in a wide valley with a creek running through it, the ranch was larger and more developed than she had expected. The main house was an impressive two-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Several smaller cabins were arranged in a semicircle nearby, smoke rising from their chimneys. Beyond them lay barns, corrals, and outbuildings, all well maintained, and in the distance, Flora could see cattle grazing on the lush grass of the valley. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Hank's weathered face softened. "Prettiest spot in the territory, if you ask me." "That's another thing about Mr. Turner. He doesn't just see land as something to use up. He takes care of it." As they approached the main house, Flora saw several people emerge onto the porch. Mrs. Whitaker was there, along with a group of children ranging from small to adolescent, and at the center, Quincy Turner himself. He had changed from his town clothes into more practical ranch wear denims, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a well-worn leather vest, but he still cut an impressive figure as he stepped forward to help Flora down from the wagon. "Welcome to Turner Ranch, Miss Redwood," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," Flora assured him, suddenly aware of her appearance after the dusty ride. She brushed at her skirt self-consciously. "It was quite pleasant." "Actually?" Turner turned to the children, who were regarding Flora with varying degrees of curiosity and shyness. "Everyone, this is Miss Redwood, your new teacher." A chorus of "Hello, Miss Redwood" greeted her, some voices enthusiastic, others more reserved. "We're so pleased you've joined us," Mrs. Whitaker said, coming forward to take Flora's arm. "Come inside, dear. You must be tired and thirsty after your journey. Children, you can meet Miss Redwood properly tomorrow when lessons begin." With that, the housekeeper ushered Flora into the house, leaving Turner to speak with Hank and the children to disperse to their afternoon activities. The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as its exterior, spacious and well-constructed, with high ceilings and large windows that let in ample light. The furnishings were solid and of good quality, though more practical than ostentatious. It was, Flora thought, a perfect reflection of Quincy Turner himself. Substantial, unpretentious, but with an underlying elegance. Mrs. Whitaker led her through the main living areas and into the east wing of the house. "This will be your room," she announced, opening a door to reveal a pleasant chamber with a comfortable-looking bed, a small writing desk, a wardrobe, and a washstand. A colorful quilt adorned the bed, and curtains in a matching fabric framed the window, which offered a view of the creek and the mountains beyond. "The washroom is just down the hall, and my quarters are across the way. Mr. Turner's rooms are in the west wing, along with his study." Flora set down her small traveling bag, deeply touched by the obvious care that had gone into preparing the room. There were fresh flowers on the desk, a small bookshelf with several volumes, and even a rocking chair by the window. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "Far more comfortable than I expected." Mrs. Whitaker looked pleased. "Mr. Turner wanted you to feel welcome. Now, your trunk should be along shortly. Why don't you rest a bit and I'll call you when dinner's ready. We eat at 6 sharp." Left alone, Flora moved to the window, gazing out at the breathtaking landscape. The mountains in the distance were already showing hints of the first snow on their peaks, though the valley remained lush and green. It was a far cry from the brick and cobblestones of Boston, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, Flora felt a sense of rightness, as if perhaps this was where she was meant to be all along. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into a fresh dress, and was just pinning up her hair when there was a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Quincy Turner himself, her trunk at his feet. "I thought you might be wanting this," he said, a little breathlessly. "Hank had to attend to the horses, so I took the liberty." "You didn't have to carry it yourself," Flora protested, noting the sheen of perspiration on his brow. The trunk, while not large, was solid oak and quite heavy. Turner shrugged, the movement rippling through his broad shoulders. "I was heading this way regardless. My study is just down the hall from your classroom, which is the large room at the end of this corridor. Would you like to see it?" Flora nodded eagerly, and after helping him move the trunk into her room, she followed him to what would be her classroom. It was a spacious room with large windows on two sides, providing excellent light. Several desks of varying sizes had been arranged in neat rows, and at the front of the room stood a teacher's desk and a large blackboard. "This was originally intended as a ballroom," Turner explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "My architect had grand ideas about entertaining, but I've never had much use for it. I thought it would serve better as a schoolroom." "It's perfect," Flora assured him, already envisioning how she would arrange the space. "The light is excellent and there's plenty of room for the children to move about." Turner's face brightened at her approval. "The supplies we purchased yesterday are in those cabinets. And I took the liberty of ordering some additional books from Denver. They should arrive within the week." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you don't find me presumptuous, but I've been gathering books for some time, hoping to eventually establish a proper school here." "That's not presumptuous at all," Flora said warmly. "It's commendable. Education is so important, especially in remote areas like this." "My thoughts exactly." There was a look of such pleasure in his eyes that Flora felt her heart give a peculiar little flutter. "My own education was somewhat haphazard after I left St. Louis. I've always regretted not having a more thorough grounding in certain subjects." This modest admission touched Flora deeply. Here was a man who had clearly achieved significant success through his own efforts, yet he valued learning and recognized its importance for the children in his care. "Well, it's never too late to learn," she found herself saying. "Perhaps you could join us for lessons occasionally." The moment the words left her mouth, Flora feared she had overstepped, but Turner's response was enthusiastic. "I'd like that very much, if you're sure I wouldn't be disrupting your teaching." "Not at all. In fact, it would set a good example for the children to see an adult valuing education so highly." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, and Flora felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She looked away first, moving to examine the blackboard more closely. "Dinner will be ready soon," Turner said after a moment. "Would you like me to show you the rest of the house first?" Flora welcomed the suggestion, and for the next half hour, Turner guided her through the ranch house, explaining its layout and introducing her to the few staff members they encountered. There was a cook, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Montana with her husband during the gold rush years, a young maid named Betsy, and a man of all work called Jim, who maintained the house and grounds. Throughout the tour, Flora was struck by the easy manner in which Turner interacted with his employees, respectful, often humorous, and genuinely interested in their welfare. It was clear that the admiration Hank had expressed was shared by the entire household. Dinner was served in a comfortable dining room with views of the setting sun. Mrs. Whitaker joined them, as did the ranch foreman, a weathered man in his 40s named Daniel Wallace, whom Turner introduced as his right hand and occasional conscience. The meal was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and apple pie for dessert, and the conversation flowed easily. Flora learned that Wallace had been with Turner since the beginning, having come from California with him. Craziest thing I ever did, following this greenhorn east, the foreman commented with a wry smile. But I had a feeling about him. Some men talk big but can't back it up. Quincy here. He's the opposite, does more than he says he will. Daniel gives me too much credit, Turner demurred. I've made my share of mistakes. And learned from 'em, Wallace countered. That's what counts. After dinner, they retired to the living room, where Wallace excused himself to check on a mare that was close to foaling. Mrs. Whitaker produced some mending, and Turner invited Flora to examine the bookshelves that lined one wall of the room. Please feel free to borrow anything that interests you, he said, watching as she ran her fingers along the spines. Books are meant to be read, not just displayed. You have an impressive collection, Flora noted, surprised by the variety. Alongside practical volumes on ranching and animal husbandry were classics of literature, history, science, and even poetry. Wordsworth? She questioned, pulling out a well-worn volume. Turner looked slightly abashed. A favorite from my younger days. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, Flora continued the quotation. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. His eyes widened in pleased surprise. You know Wordsworth. My father is a professor of literature at Harvard, she explained. Our home was always filled with books. They spent the next hour discussing literature, discovering shared favorites, and good-naturedly debating the merits of various authors. Mrs. Whitaker watched them with a knowing smile, occasionally contributing an opinion, but mostly content to observe. As the mantel clock struck 9, Flora reluctantly acknowledged that she should retire if she was to be fresh for her first day of teaching. Turner walked her to her room, pausing at the door. I want to thank you again for accepting this position, he said earnestly. I know it was a leap of faith on your part. And on yours, Flora pointed out. You know very little about me or my qualifications. I know enough, he replied simply. Then, with a slight bow, he wished her good night and departed, leaving Flora to wonder at the strange sense of belonging she already felt in this place. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Flora established her classroom routine and became acquainted with her pupils. There were 7 children in total. Tommy Wilson, whom she had met in town, his sister Sarah, a serious 10-year-old with a gift for mathematics, the Wallace twins, Peter and Paul, mischievous 8-year-olds who kept her on her toes, Mei Chen, the cook's 12-year-old daughter, quiet but brilliantly intelligent, and the Jenkins siblings, Eliza and Robert, 14 and 13 respectively, the children of another ranch hand. Flora quickly discovered that despite their varied backgrounds and previous education, or lack thereof, all the children were eager to learn. They absorbed knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain, and their enthusiasm made teaching a joy rather than a chore. True to his word, Quincy Turner occasionally joined the lessons, sitting at the back of the classroom and participating with a humility that endeared him to Flora more each day. She found him to be a quick study, filling in gaps in his knowledge with remarkable speed, and his presence seemed to inspire the children to greater efforts. Outside the classroom, Flora gradually settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She assisted Mrs. Whitaker with household accounts and correspondence in the afternoons, took meals with the family like group that gathered in the dining room each evening, and spent her evenings reading or engaging in conversation with Turner and whoever else might be present. She also began to explore the ranch, initially just the immediate surroundings of the house but gradually venturing further afield. On Sundays, when there were no lessons, she often walked along the creek, marveling at the beauty of the landscape and the abundance of wildlife deer coming to drink at dawn and dusk, eagles soaring overhead, and once, to her delight, a family of otters playing in the water. It was during one such Sunday walk, about 3 weeks after her arrival, that Flora encountered Turner on horseback. He was riding a magnificent black stallion that she recognized as Thunderbolt, the horse Tommy had mentioned in town. "Miss Redwood," he called, reining in beside her. "Enjoying the fine weather?" "Very much so," she replied, shading her eyes to look up at him. The autumn sun caught in his dark hair, bringing out hints of auburn, and his face was relaxed and open in a way she had come to treasure. "Your land is beautiful, Mr. Turner. Would you like to see more of it?" he asked impulsively. "I could saddle a gentle mare for you, if you ride." Flora hesitated. She did ride, having learned as a child at her grandfather's country estate, but it had been some time. "I'm not sure I remember how," she admitted. Turner's smile was encouraging. "Like many things, it tends to come back to you. But only if you wish, of course." The idea was suddenly appealing to see more of the ranch, to experience the freedom of horseback, and, though she barely acknowledged it even to herself, to spend time alone with Quincy Turner away from the watchful eyes of the household. "I would like that," she decided, "if you're sure you can spare the time." "For you, Miss Redwood. Always." The words were spoken lightly, almost teasingly, but there was something in his eyes that made Flora's breath catch. Without waiting for her response, Turner dismounted in one fluid motion and offered her his arm. "Shall we return to the stables? I think Daisy would suit you well. She's gentle but spirited, much like yourself." The comparison brought a blush to Flora's cheeks, but she accepted his arm, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her as they walked back toward the ranch buildings. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on the progress of her students, the changing season, and Turner's plans for expanding the herd next spring. At the stables, he personally selected a pretty dappled mare and supervised the saddling, checking every strap with meticulous care. "Your safety is paramount," he explained when Flora commented on his thoroughness. "I wouldn't forgive myself if you came to harm on my watch." Once Daisy was ready, Turner offered his cupped hands to help Flora mount. She placed her boot in his palms, feeling the strength in his arms as he boosted her effortlessly into the saddle. After ensuring she was comfortable and reviewing the basics of handling the reins, he remounted Thunderbolt, and they set off at a gentle pace. Turner led her along well-established trails, showing her parts of the ranch she hadn't yet seen: the northern pastures, where the newest calves grazed with their mothers, a hidden valley lush with wildflowers despite the advancing season, and finally, a rise that offered a panoramic view of the entire property. "It's breathtaking," Flora said, gazing out at the vast expanse of land. The ranch house looked small from this height, nestled in its valley like a toy in a child's diorama. Beyond it, the land rolled away to the distant mountains, painted in shades of gold and russet by the autumn sun. Turner's expression as he surveyed his domain was complex pride mingled with responsibility and something deeper, a kind of reverence. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real," he admitted, "that all this is mine to steward." He turned to her, his green eyes serious. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw this land?" Flora shook her head, captivated by the intensity in his gaze. "I thought, this is where I belong. This is where I can build something that matters." He looked away, a shadow crossing his face. "In St. Louis, in my father's bank, I was just going through the motions, living someone else's idea of success. Here, I feel authentic." It was the most personal thing he had shared with her, and Flora found herself deeply moved by his honesty. "I understand," she said softly. "That's how I felt when I decided to come west. My parents wanted me to marry well, to be a society wife hosting dinner parties and charitable events. But I wanted something real, something that was truly mine. Turner's eyes returned to her face, his expression warming. And have you found it? Something real? The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Flora looked out at the landscape, then back at the man beside her, and felt a certainty settle in her heart. I believe I have, she answered truthfully. His smile in response was like the sun breaking through clouds, illuminating his entire face. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the horses shifting beneath them, the breeze playing with Flora's hair. Then Turner cleared his throat, breaking the spell. We should head back. The light will be fading soon, and I promised Mrs. Whitaker we'd return in time for dinner. As they rode back to the ranch house, Flora found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, seeing him with new eyes. Over the past weeks, her initial wariness had given way to respect, which had in turn blossomed into friendship. But now she was forced to acknowledge that her feelings had evolved into something deeper. Something that made her heart race when he entered a room and left her thinking about him long after they had parted. It was foolish, she told herself sternly. She had been at Turner Ranch less than a month. She knew almost nothing about Quincy Turner's past beyond what he had chosen to share. And she had come west specifically to escape the expectation that a woman's only path to security was through marriage. Yet as they approached the stables and Turner once again helped her dismount, his hands lingering slightly at her waist, Flora couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach or the warmth that spread through her at his touch. Whether wise or foolish, her heart was making decisions without consulting her head, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to overrule it. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Whitaker commented on Flora's flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "The fresh air agrees with you, my dear," she said with a knowing glance between Flora and Turner. "You should ride more often." "I was just telling Miss Redwood the same thing," Turner replied, his eyes meeting Flora's across the table. "The ranch is at its most beautiful in autumn." "Indeed it is," Mrs. Whitaker agreed, "though I prefer to admire it from the porch these days. My old bones aren't made for horseback anymore." "Nonsense," Turner scoffed good-naturedly. "You're as spry as ever, Mrs. Whitaker. You simply prefer to keep your feet on solid ground." The banter continued throughout the meal, with Wallace joining in when he arrived slightly late, apologizing for having been delayed by a minor crisis with the livestock. Flora watched the interactions with a growing sense of belonging. This unlikely collection of people, the rancher, the housekeeper, the foreman, and herself, had formed a kind of family, bound together not by blood, but by mutual respect and genuine affection. Later that night, as Flora prepared for bed, she found herself lingering at the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. In Boston, she had always felt constrained, hemmed in by expectations and conventions. Here, paradoxically, though she was miles from the nearest town and dependent on Quincy Turner's employment, she felt freer than she ever had before. The realization brought with it a pang of anxiety. What if, after the trial month ended, Turner decided she wasn't suited for the position after all? What if her growing feelings for him were one-sided, a schoolgirl infatuation that would embarrass them both if revealed? Flora turned from the window, forcing herself to be practical. She had been at Turner Ranch for nearly 3 weeks now. In another week, the trial period would end, and she would have to make a decision about her future. The sensible course would be to focus on her teaching, to prove her worth in that capacity, and to keep her personal feelings strictly to herself. With that resolution firmly in mind, Flora got into bed, but sleep was long in coming. Her thoughts kept returning to the moment on the hilltop when Turner had asked if she had found something real, and the look in his eyes when she had answered. The next morning, Flora woke to the sound of voices raised in alarm. Throwing on her robe, she hurried to the window to see several ranch hands running toward the western pasture. Smoke was rising in the distance, a dark plume against the clear autumn sky. Dressing quickly, she made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Chen was preparing breakfast with unusual haste. "What's happening?" Flora asked. "Fire," the cook replied tersely. "Mr. Turner and Mr. Wallace gone to help. Very bad if reach hay storage." Mrs. Whitaker bustled in, looking worried. "The men are trying to contain it before it spreads," she explained more fully. "A lightning strike most likely, from that storm that passed through last night. The ground is dry despite the recent rains." "Should we cancel lessons for today?" Flora asked, concerned for the children whose fathers might be fighting the fire. "No, no," Mrs. Whitaker decided after a moment's thought. "Better to keep the routine, keep the children occupied. Their mothers will be worried enough without having them underfoot." Flora nodded, understanding the wisdom of this approach. "Is there anything I can do to help now, before the children arrive?" "You could help Mrs. Chen prepare food and water for the men. They'll be hungry and thirsty when they can take a break." For the next hour, Flora worked alongside the cook, preparing sandwiches and filling canteens with water. As they worked, she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window, searching for any sign of Turner or news of the fire's progress. The children began to arrive at the usual time, some accompanied by mothers whose tight expressions betrayed their concern. Flora greeted them calmly, assuring the women that they would keep the children safe and occupied until the crisis had passed. Once in the classroom, Flora did her best to maintain a normal routine, though she could tell that the children were distracted. She had just begun the mathematics lesson when the door opened, and Quincy Turner himself appeared, his face streaked with soot, his clothing singed in places. "Mr. Turner!" Flora exclaimed, setting down her chalk. "Is everything all right?" He nodded, offering a reassuring smile to the children. "The fire is under control. We've contained it to the western pasture, and the wind is in our favor." His gaze returned to Flora. "I thought you and the children might want to know." There was a collective sigh of relief from the pupils, and Tommy Wilson piped up. "Is my pa okay, Mr. Turner?" "He's fine, Tommy. Everyone is. Some of the men will stay to ensure the fire doesn't flare up again, but the immediate danger has passed." Turner glanced at Flora. "I apologize for interrupting your lesson, Miss Redwood. Please continue." As he turned to leave, Flora impulsively called after him. "Mr. Turner, are you injured?" He paused, looking down at himself as if noticing his disheveled state for the first time. "Nothing serious. A few minor burns and scrapes." "You should have Mrs. Whitaker tend to them," Flora insisted, concern evident in her voice. Something softened in Turner's expression. "I will," he promised, "as soon as I've cleaned up a bit." With that, he departed, and Flora turned back to her students, aware that 7 pairs of eyes were watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and understanding. "Now, where were we?" she asked briskly, returning to the mathematics problem on the blackboard. The rest of the morning passed without incident, though Flora found her thoughts frequently straying to Turner. When the children broke for their midday meal, she sought out Mrs. Whitaker, finding the housekeeper in the kitchen preparing a tray. "Is Mr. Turner all right?" Flora asked without preamble. Mrs. Whitaker's expression was knowing but kind. "He'll live. Some minor burns on his hands and a cut on his forehead where a branch caught him. Nothing that won't heal with proper care." She nodded toward the tray. "I'm just taking him some lunch. He's in his study, catching up on correspondence now that the excitement is over." "Let me," Flora offered impulsively. "You must have enough to do. And I have a few minutes before afternoon lessons begin." The housekeeper raised an eyebrow but handed over the tray without comment. "His study is at the end of the west corridor, as you know. Knock first, he gets startled when he's deep in thought." Flora made her way through the house, balancing the tray carefully. At Turner's study door she paused, suddenly uncertain. Was she overstepping? Would he think her forward? Before she could reconsider, she knocked firmly. "Come in," Turner's voice called. Pushing the door open with her shoulder, Flora entered a room that perfectly reflected its occupant. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the large desk positioned to take advantage of the natural light from the window. There were maps of the ranch and surrounding territory pinned to one wall, and a comfortable seating area with worn leather chairs occupied another corner. Turner himself sat at the desk, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that bore the evidence of his morning's work, several small burns and scratches. He looked up as she entered, surprise and pleasure lighting his features. "Miss Redwood, I wasn't expecting you. Mrs. Whitaker thought you might be hungry," Flora explained, setting the tray on a clear corner of the desk. "And I wanted to make sure you were really all right." He smiled, though the expression turned to a wince as the movement pulled at a cut on his forehead. "As you can see, I'm somewhat the worse for wear, but nothing serious." Flora frowned, noting that the cut hadn't been properly cleaned. "That should be tended to," she said, pointing. "It could become infected." Turner touched the wound gingerly. "I was going to see to it after I finished these letters. We had a cattle shipment scheduled for next week that may need to be postponed depending on the extent of the damage." "The letters can wait a few minutes," Flora said firmly. Without waiting for his response, she moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room that she suspected might contain medical supplies. Her intuition proved correct. Inside were bandages, ointments, and a bottle of whiskey that she guessed served as disinfectant. "You seem to know my study better than I do," Turner observed, amusement evident in his voice. "It's logically arranged," Flora replied, gathering what she needed. "Like everything else about you, Mr. Turner." She returned to the desk and set the supplies down, then dipped a clean cloth in water from the pitcher on the tray. "If you'll permit me," she said, suddenly conscious of how forward she was being. Turner's expression sobered, but he nodded, turning his face up to her. Gently, Flora began cleaning the cut, acutely aware of their proximity. She could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the fine lines at their corners that appeared when he smiled, the strong line of his jaw now darkened with stubble. "This may sting," she warned, pouring a small amount of whiskey onto a fresh cloth. "I'm no stranger to pain, Miss Redwood," he said quietly. Nevertheless, he flinched slightly when she applied the disinfectant, and Flora murmured an apology. "Almost done," she assured him, reaching for a bandage. As she pressed it carefully over the wound, her fingers brushed against his hair, which was surprisingly soft despite its disheveled state. "There," she said, stepping back to survey her work. "That should heal nicely now." Turner caught her hand before she could withdraw completely. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Not just for this, but for staying calm with the children today, for fitting into life here as if you've always been a part of it." Flora's heart thundered in her chest at the warmth of his hand around hers and the intensity in his gaze. "It's been easy to fit in," she managed to say. "Everyone has been so welcoming." "Have they?" Turner asked, still holding her hand. "Or is it that you bring something with you that makes a place feel more like home?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Flora couldn't look away from his face, couldn't ignore the way his thumb was gently stroking the back of her hand, sending tingles up her arm. "Mr. Turner, A knock at the door interrupted whatever she might have said. Turner released her hand reluctantly as Wallace entered, bringing news about the fire damage. The foreman glanced between them, a knowing look crossing his weathered features, but he made no comment on finding Flora in Turner's study. "I should get back to the classroom," Flora said, gathering up the medical supplies. "The children will be returning from their meal soon." Turner nodded, his expression unreadable now. "Of course. Thank you again for your assistance, Miss Redwood." As Flora left the study, she could feel Wallace's curious gaze following her, but she kept her head high and her pace steady. Only when she was safely back in her own classroom did she allow herself to lean against the desk, her legs suddenly weak. What had just happened? What had she been about to say before Wallace interrupted? And more importantly, what did it mean that Quincy Turner had looked at her that way, had held her hand as if he never wanted to let go? The afternoon lessons were a blur, with Flora going through the motions while her mind replayed the scene in the study again and again. By the time the children departed for the day, she had come to no conclusions except that her feelings for Quincy Turner had progressed far beyond what was appropriate for an employee. That evening at dinner, Turner was absent, having ridden out with Wallace to assess the full extent of the fire damage. Mrs. Whitaker, observing Flora's distraction, commented gently, "He'll be back late, most likely. No sense in waiting up." Flora felt her cheeks warm at the implication that she might have been planning to do just that. "I wasn't going to," she protested. "I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." The housekeeper's smile was knowing but kind. "Of course, dear. It's just that a man like Quincy Turner can be quite distracting, especially for a young woman far from home." Flora considered denying it, but something in Mrs. Whitaker's expression told her that the older woman would see through any pretense. "Is it that obvious?" she asked instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only to someone who's been watching you both these past weeks," Mrs. Whitaker replied. "And don't worry, I approve. You're good for him, Flora. You bring light into rooms that have been dark too long." The use of her first name, unusual for the formal housekeeper, emphasized the personal nature of the conversation. "I don't know what to do," Flora admitted. "I came west to be independent, to prove I could make my own way, not to develop feelings for my employer." Mrs. Whitaker reached across the table to pat her hand. "Life rarely follows the paths we lay out for ourselves, my dear. Sometimes it leads us where we need to go, not where we thought we wanted to be." She rose, signaling an end to the conversation. "Get some rest. Things have a way of becoming clearer in the morning light." That night, Flora slept fitfully, her dreams a confused jumble of burning fields and green eyes. She woke before dawn, feeling unrested but too restless to remain in bed. Dressing quickly, she decided to go for a walk, hoping the crisp morning air would clear her head. The ranch was quiet at this hour, with only the earliest risers, the cook, and a few of the hands beginning their day. Flora made her way to the creek, following its meandering course away from the house. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, promising another clear autumn day. She had walked perhaps half a mile when she spotted a solitary figure on the bank ahead, seated on a large rock, gazing out at the water. Even in the dim light, she recognized Quincy Turner's broad-shouldered silhouette. Her first instinct was to turn back, to avoid what might be an awkward encounter after yesterday's charged moment in his study. But before she could retreat, he turned, alerted perhaps by some sound she had made. "Miss Redwood?" he called, standing. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she replied, moving forward since retreat was now impossible without appearing rude. "I couldn't sleep and thought a walk might help. I'm sorry if I disturbed your solitude." "Not at all," he assured her. As she drew nearer, she could see that he looked tired, with shadows beneath his eyes suggesting he had slept no better than she had. "I often come here in the early morning. It's peaceful." Flora nodded, understanding the appeal. The creek bubbled gently over rocks, and the first birds were beginning to greet the day with tentative songs. "How bad was the fire damage?" she asked, seeking neutral ground. "Not as severe as it might have been," Turner replied. "We lost some grazing land, but no livestock, and none of the structures were touched. We were fortunate." "Thanks to your quick action," Flora said, remembering how he had looked when he appeared in her classroom, soot-streaked and weary but determined. Turner shrugged modestly. "Every man on the ranch did his part. That's how we survive out here, by working together." They fell silent, watching as the sky gradually lightened, painting the landscape in soft pinks and golds. Flora was acutely aware of Turner's presence beside her, of the scant inches separating them, of the way the dawning light caught in his dark hair and emphasized the strong lines of his profile. "Your trial month is nearly over," he said suddenly, still looking at the creek, rather than at her. "Are you happy here, Miss Redwood?" The question took her by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Happier than I expected to be." Now he did turn to look at her, his green eyes searching her face. "Then you'll stay? Beyond the month, I mean?" "Do you want me to?" Flora asked, her heart beating faster. "Very much," Turner replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "More than I have any right to ask." There was something in his tone that made Flora's breath catch, something that went beyond the simple question of her employment. "Mr. Turner," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling that something needed to be said. "Quincy," he corrected gently. "Please, I'd like to hear you say my name, at least once." "Quincy," Flora repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. "I came west to be independent, to build a life on my own terms." "I know," he said, his expression growing guarded. "And I would never ask you to sacrifice that independence." Flora took a deep breath, gathering her courage. What if it's not a sacrifice? What if... What if sharing a life with the right person could make us both stronger, not weaker? Hope flared in his eyes, transforming his face. "Flora," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent a shiver through her. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that I've come to care for you," she interrupted, needing to get the words out before her nerve failed her. "More than I should, perhaps, given our respective positions, but I can't pretend otherwise. Not anymore." For a moment, Turner Quincy simply stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. Then, slowly, he reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I've been fighting my feelings for you since the day we met," he confessed, telling myself it was too soon, that you deserved time to adjust to life here without complications, that, as your employer, I had no right to speak of personal matters. He squeezed her hand. "But the truth is, Flora Redwood, you've brought something to my life, to this ranch, that I didn't even know was missing until you arrived." "And what's that?" Flora asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Quincy's smile was like the sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual at first, then blazing with warmth. "Hope," he said simply. "You've brought me hope." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Flora remembered their first meeting, how desperate and alone she had felt, how his kindness had been a lifeline when she was drowning. "That day in town," she said softly, "when you found me hiding from Mr. Hollister, I thought all was lost. I had no money, no prospects, nowhere to go." She looked up at him, letting him see the depth of her feeling. "I thought I was hopeless." "But you weren't," Quincy said, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You were never hopeless, Flora. You were just waiting for the right opportunity, the right place." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The right person, perhaps." Flora leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "And have I found him? The right person?" Instead of answering with words, Quincy bent his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, questioning at first, then deepening as Flora responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've loved you since I first saw you," he admitted, standing there in the shadows, so proud despite your circumstances, so determined to maintain your dignity. "I thought you were too good to be true," Flora confessed. A handsome cowboy appearing out of nowhere to rescue me? It seemed like something from a dime novel. Quincy chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. I'm very real, I assure you, and far from perfect. Perfect would be boring, Flora said, smiling up at him. I prefer real. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his arms encircling her waist to draw her closer. Flora responded eagerly, all her doubts and hesitations melting away in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally broke apart, the sun had fully risen, bathing the landscape in golden light. We should get back, Quincy said reluctantly. The ranch will be waking up, and your students will be arriving soon. Flora nodded, though she was loath to end this perfect moment. What happens now? She asked as they began walking back toward the house, hand in hand. Quincy glanced down at her, his expression serious but tender. That depends on you, Flora. I know we haven't known each other long, by conventional standards. I know you came west seeking independence, not attachment. He squeezed her hand. I won't rush you, and I won't pressure you. We can take as much time as you need to be sure of your feelings, of what you want. His consideration touched her deeply. And what about you? She asked. What do you want, Quincy? He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I want you in my life, he said simply. As my partner, my equal. Whether that means as the teacher at Turner Ranch or... He hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. Or as something more permanent. That's for you to decide. But know this. Flora Redwood, you have given me hope, and I intend to be your hope in return, for as long as you'll allow it. Flora's heart swelled with emotion at his words, at the sincerity in his eyes. She had come west seeking a new beginning, a chance to prove herself, to build a life on her own terms. What she had found, unexpectedly, was not just independence, but connection to this land, to the children she taught, and most of all, to this remarkable man who looked at her as if she were the sunrise after a long, dark night. I think, she said slowly, that we should give ourselves time to know each other better before making any permanent decisions. She smiled up at him, her heart in her eyes. But I also think that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, Quincy Turner, and I'm not going anywhere. The smile that broke across his face was like nothing she had ever seen, joy and relief and hope all mingled together. That's all I could ask for, he said, bringing her hand to his lips. For now. As they resumed their walk back to the ranch house, the morning sun warm on their faces and their fingers intertwined, Flora felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead might not be the one she had envisioned when she boarded that train in Boston 6 months ago, but it was a path filled with promise, with purpose, and with love. And for a woman who had once thought herself hopeless, that was more than enough. The following weeks passed in a blur of joy and discovery as Flora and Quincy's relationship deepened. They were discreet, mindful of propriety and the example they set for the children, but it soon became obvious to everyone at Turner Ranch that something had changed between them. Mrs. Whitaker observed their growing closeness with approving eyes, while Wallace occasionally teased Quincy about the spring in his step. Flora continued her teaching duties with renewed enthusiasm, finding that her happiness spilled over into her classroom. The children responded to her positive energy, making even greater strides in their studies. She took particular satisfaction in watching Mei Chen blossom under her guidance, the girl's natural intelligence finding an outlet in the books and materials Quincy had provided. For his part, Quincy made time each day to be with Flora, despite the demands of running the ranch. Sometimes they rode together in the late afternoons, exploring the farthest reaches of his property. Other times, they simply sat in the living room after dinner, reading or talking while Mrs. Whitaker pretended not to notice the way their hands occasionally met or their eyes lingered on each other. On Sundays, they often picnicked by the creek, sometimes joined by the ranch children, but just as often alone, using the opportunity to learn more about each other's pasts and dreams for the future. It was during one such Sunday outing, as autumn deepened toward winter, that Quincy first spoke of his family in detail. They were seated on a blanket beneath an aspen tree, its golden leaves creating a canopy above them and occasionally drifting down to land in Flora's hair or on the remains of their lunch. "My father was a good man," Quincy said, idly twirling a leaf between his fingers. "Strict, traditional, but fair. He built his bank from nothing, and he expected me to appreciate the legacy he was creating." He sighed, looking out at the water. "I tried, Flora. For years, I sat behind that mahogany desk, wore the right clothes, said the right things, but I felt like I was slowly suffocating." Flora reached over to take his hand, understanding all too well the weight of parental expectations. "What happened?" "He died," Quincy said simply. "Heart failure, when I was 26. And suddenly, there I was, sole owner of Turner Banking and Trust, with everyone expecting me to step seamlessly into his shoes." He squeezed her hand. "I held on for a year, trying to honor his memory, but in the end, I couldn't do it. I sold the bank to his deputy manager, a man who actually loved the business, and headed west with no real plan except to find something that felt right." "And you found this place?" Flora prompted when he fell silent. A smile softened his features. "Not right away. I wandered for a while, worked on ranches in California, learned the business from the ground up. Then I heard about land opening up here in Montana. The moment I saw this valley, I knew." His green eyes met hers. "The same way I knew about you, that day in Willow Creek. Some things, you just recognize when you find them." Flora's heart fluttered at the intensity in his gaze. "I think I understand," she said softly. "When I first arrived here, despite everything that had gone wrong with my plans, something felt right, as if I'd found where I was supposed to be, even if I didn't realize it yet." Quincy leaned forward, brushing a stray leaf from her hair with gentle fingers. "And now? Do you still feel that way?" "Even more so," Flora admitted, her cheeks warming under his touch. "Though I never imagined I'd find myself falling in love with a cowboy." The words slipped out before she could consider their implications, but once spoken, she couldn't regret them. They were true. She had fallen in love with Quincy Turner, with his strength and his kindness, his intelligence and his occasional stubbornness, his respect for her independence, and his unabashed admiration of her abilities. Quincy's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Then his face broke into a smile of such pure happiness that it took Flora's breath away. "Say that again," he requested, his voice husky with emotion. Flora met his gaze steadily, her heart in her eyes. "I love you, Quincy Turner. I think I have almost from the beginning, though I was too stubborn to admit it." In answer, he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words of his own feelings. When they finally parted, he cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious despite the joy radiating from him. "I love you, Flora Redwood," he said, each word deliberate and heartfelt. "More than I ever thought possible. You've brought light and learning and laughter into my life, and I don't want to imagine a future without you in it." Flora's eyes filled with tears at the simple, profound declaration. "Then don't," she whispered, covering his hands with her own, "because I don't intend to go anywhere." Quincy kissed her again, more gently this time, then drew back slightly, his expression turning thoughtful. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Flora's breath caught as he produced a small velvet box, her mind racing ahead to what it might contain. Quincy seemed to read her thoughts, for he smiled reassuringly. It's not what you're thinking, not yet. Though that's certainly where my heart is heading. He opened the box to reveal not a ring, but a delicate silver key. This is a key to the east wing of the ranch house, your wing. I had it made specially. He took her hand, placing the key in her palm and closing her fingers around it. I want you to know that your place here is secure, Flora, regardless of what develops between us personally. The teaching position is yours for as long as you want it. The wing is your home, and your independence is something I will always respect. Flora stared at the key, deeply moved by the gesture and what it represented. Quincy wasn't asking her to choose between her autonomy and their relationship, he was offering her both, on her own terms. Thank you, she said softly, closing her hand around the key. This means more to me than I can express. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. But you should know, Quincy, that while I treasure my independence, I'm beginning to see that true partnership doesn't threaten it, it enhances it. His smile was tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I've always believed that the strongest partnerships are those where both people can stand on their own, but choose to stand together. Is that what we're building? A partnership? Flora asked, though she already knew the answer. I hope so, Quincy replied, his voice carrying a depth of feeling that resonated through her. A partnership in all things, in work, in purpose, in life. He hesitated, then added softly, in love. Flora leaned forward to kiss him, putting all her feelings into the gesture. When they separated, she kept her face close to his, her eyes meeting his steadily. I like the sound of that, Quincy Turner. A partnership in all things. As they gathered up their picnic things and prepared to return to the ranch house, Flora felt a sense of peace and certainty that had been absent for much of her life. She had come west seeking independence and found something even more valuable, a place where she could be fully herself, valued for her mind and her spirit, alongside a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession or an ornament. The Montana winter arrived with sudden ferocity in early December, blanketing Turner Ranch in snow and transforming the landscape into a glittering white expanse. Life on the ranch adapted to the changed conditions. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the barns. The daily routines shifted to accommodate the shorter daylight hours, and the ranch house became a warm haven against the bitter cold. Flora's classroom relocated to the living room on the coldest days, with a roaring fire in the hearth, making the space cozy despite the howling wind outside. The children, bundled in layers of wool and flannel, arrived by sleigh from the outlying cabins, their cheeks red with cold, but their eyes bright with excitement at the adventure of it all. As Christmas approached, the ranch house took on a festive air. Mrs. Whitaker supervised the hanging of evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and Quincy himself rode out with some of the hands to find the perfect pine tree for the living room. Flora enlisted the children's help in making ornaments, paper stars, strings of berries and popcorn, and small figures carved from wood by the more skilled among them. The holiday preparations brought a special kind of joy to Flora, who had always loved Christmas but had found the elaborate society celebrations in Boston somewhat hollow. Here, the festivities had a genuine warmth and simplicity that touched her heart. One evening, about a week before Christmas, she was in the kitchen with Mrs. Whitaker and Mrs. Chen, teaching the children to make gingerbread cookies, when Quincy appeared in the doorway. He watched them for a moment, a smile playing around his lips, before clearing his throat to announce his presence. Something smells wonderful, he commented, entering the room. Tommy Wilson, his face smudged with flour, looked up proudly. We're making Christmas cookies, Mr. Turner. Miss Redwood says it's a tradition. A fine tradition indeed, Quincy agreed, moving to stand beside Flora. His hand brushed against hers, a brief touch that nevertheless sent warmth coursing through her. "I wonder if I might borrow Miss Redwood for a moment. There's something I'd like to show her." Mrs. Whitaker shooed them out with a knowing smile. "Go on then, we can manage here." Curious, Flora followed Quincy through the house and out onto the porch, where he helped her into her coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck with tender care. "Where are we going?" she asked as he led her down the steps. "You'll see," he replied mysteriously, guiding her toward the stables. To Flora's surprise, a sleigh awaited them, hitched to a pair of sturdy horses and equipped with warm blankets and hot bricks wrapped in flannel to keep their feet warm. "A sleigh ride?" she asked, delighted. "What's the occasion?" Quincy helped her into the vehicle, then climbed in beside her, arranging the blankets over their laps. "Does there need to be an occasion to take a beautiful woman for a ride in the moonlight?" Flora laughed, leaning against his solid warmth as he took up the reins. "I suppose not, though I suspect you have something specific in mind." He gave her a sidelong glance, his eyes twinkling in the light from the lantern attached to the sleigh. "Perhaps I do." The horses set off at a brisk pace, their hooves making a muffled sound in the snow. The night was clear and cold, the full moon casting a silvery light over the landscape and making the snow sparkle as if strewn with diamonds. Flora's breath formed small clouds in the air as she gazed in wonder at the transformed ranch. "It's magical," she murmured, nestling closer to Quincy's side. "Like something from a fairy tale?" "I hoped you'd think so," he said, his arm tightening around her. "Winter can be harsh here, but it has its own kind of beauty." They rode in companionable silence for a time, following a path that led through a small forest of pines before emerging into a clearing. In the center stood a structure that Flora didn't recognize a cabin, larger than those of the ranch hands but smaller than the main house, with light glowing in its windows and smoke rising from its chimney. "What is this place?" she asked as Quincy halted the sleigh before it. "Something I've been working on," he replied, a note of nervousness entering his voice. "A surprise, of sorts." He jumped down from the sleigh and came around to help her descend. "Will you come inside?" Intrigued, Flora allowed him to lead her to the cabin door. When he opened it, she gasped in surprise. The interior was warm and inviting, with a fire crackling in a stone hearth and simple but beautiful furniture arranged to create a comfortable living space. Candles burned in wall sconces and on a small dining table set for two, and evergreen boughs adorned the mantel. "Quincy, what is this?" she asked, turning to him in confusion. He took her hands in his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "It's a place I built, thinking of the future. Our future, if you want it to be." Flora's heart began to race as the implication of his words sank in. "You built this? For us?" Quincy nodded, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I know it's soon, perhaps too soon by conventional standards, but I've never been much for convention. And I don't think you are either." He took a deep breath. "Flora Redwood, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought joy and purpose and learning to my days. You've made Turner Ranch more than just a place, you've made it a home." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, producing a small box similar to the one that had held the key, but smaller still. This time, when he opened it, a ring gleamed in the firelight, a single pearl set in a band of gold, simple but exquisite. "I love you, Flora," Quincy said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I want to build a life with you, a partnership in every sense of the word. This cabin is a symbol of that, a place that belongs to both of us, neither mine nor yours, but ours. A place where we can start our life together." He sank to one knee, looking up at her with all his heart in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" Flora's vision blurred with tears as she looked down at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed it so completely. She had traveled west seeking independence, determined to prove she could make her own way in the world. What she had found instead was something far more precious, a man who valued her for exactly who she was, who supported her dreams while sharing his own, who offered not dominance, but partnership. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Quincy Turner, I will marry you. Joy blazed across his face as he rose to his feet, slipping the ring onto her finger before gathering her into his arms. Their kiss was deep and tender, a promise of all that was to come. When they finally parted, Quincy kept his arms around her, his forehead resting against hers. I was so afraid you might think it was too soon, he admitted. Flora smiled, touching his face gently. Perhaps by some standards. But out here, we learn to recognize what matters, don't we? To seize happiness when we find it? We do indeed, he agreed, kissing her again before leading her to the table. I had Mrs. Whitaker prepare a meal for us. I thought we might have our first dinner in our new home. Our home? Flora repeated, liking the sound of it. As they sat down to the meal, a simple but delicious spread of roast chicken, vegetables from the root cellar, and fresh bread. She glanced around the cabin with new eyes, seeing the care that had gone into its construction. How long have you been planning this? Quincy looked slightly abashed. I started building it not long after you agreed to stay beyond the trial month. I know that sounds presumptuous. It sounds romantic, Flora corrected him, her heart full. And very much like you, Quincy Turner quietly making plans, building for the future. They lingered over dinner, discussing their plans with growing excitement. They would marry in the spring, when travel was easier for those they wished to invite. Flora's parents, whom she hoped might finally understand her choices when they met Quincy. His former foreman from California, the town officials from Willow Creek. And of course, everyone from the ranch, Quincy added. Their family now. Flora nodded, touched by his inclusive view. What about the school? I don't want to abandon my students. I wouldn't expect you to, Quincy assured her. I was thinking we might expand the program actually. Build a proper schoolhouse closer to town, open to all the children in the area. You could oversee it, hire additional teachers as needed. The idea caught Flora's imagination immediately. A real school, serving the whole community? Quincy, that would be wonderful. I thought you might like it, he said, his eyes warm with affection. This ranch has prospered, Flora. I want to share that prosperity, to build something lasting that benefits more than just ourselves. A legacy, Flora murmured, understanding. Something meaningful to leave behind. Exactly. Quincy reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the pearl ring that now adorned it. And speaking of leaving things behind, I received a letter from my mother last week. Flora's eyebrows rose in surprise. Quincy rarely spoke of his mother, who had remained in St. Louis after his father's death. What did she say? She's finally accepted my invitation to visit in the spring. She wants to see what I've built here, and to meet the woman who has captured her son's heart. His expression grew thoughtful. We've had our differences over the years, but she's a remarkable woman in her own right. I think you'll like each other. I look forward to meeting her, Flora said sincerely, pleased that this potential rift in Quincy's life might be healing. After dinner, they sat before the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, talking of their hopes and plans for the future. It was late when they finally returned to the main house, the moon high overhead and the world silent under its blanket of snow. Mrs. Whitaker was waiting up for them, pretending to be occupied with mending but clearly anxious for news. When she saw their radiant faces and the ring on Flora's finger, she set aside her work and rose to embrace them both. It's about time, she declared, her gruff tone belied by the moisture in her eyes. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar to get you to make it official." Quincy laughed, his arm around Flora's waist. "Your patience is rewarded, Mrs. Whitaker. We'll be married in the spring." "Spring weddings are lucky," the housekeeper pronounced, patting Flora's cheek affectionately. "Now, off to bed, both of you, separately," she added with a stern look that didn't quite hide her smile. "There'll be time enough for togetherness after the vows are spoken." As Flora prepared for bed that night, she found herself pausing at the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Her life had taken such an unexpected turn since that desperate day in Willow Creek when Quincy Turner had come to her rescue. She had been at her lowest ebb, believing herself hopeless, her dreams of independence shattered. Instead, she had found not just hope, but joy. Not just a position, but a purpose. Not just a place to live, but a home. And most precious of all, she had found a partner who saw her strengths and valued her mind, who encouraged her dreams while sharing his own. The pearl on her finger caught the moonlight, glowing softly. It was a perfect choice, Flora thought. Not a diamond, which would have been the conventional selection, but something unique and natural, with a quiet beauty that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than ostentation. Just like the man who had given it to her. With a heart full of contentment, Flora turned from the window and slipped into bed, falling asleep to dreams of spring weddings and schoolhouses and a future bright with promise. The news of Flora and Quincy's engagement spread quickly through the ranch and into Willow Creek. The reactions were universally positive. The ranch hands had come to respect, and like the schoolteacher who treated their children with such care, and the townspeople had long since decided that Quincy Turner's judgment was sound in all things. Christmas at Turner Ranch was a joyous affair, with the entire ranch community gathering in the main house for a feast prepared by Mrs. Whitaker and Mrs. Chen. Gifts were exchanged, practical items for the most part, though Quincy surprised Flora with a beautiful leather-bound journal for her teaching notes and a first edition of Wordsworth's poems that he had secretly ordered from a bookseller in Denver. Flora, in turn, had worked with the children to create a special gift for Quincy, a handmade quilt. Each square designed and sewn by a different student, representing aspects of ranch life and their lessons together. The final square, in the center, was Flora's own work, a detailed rendering of the ranch house with tiny figures representing all the inhabitants, and above it, a banner reading "Home." Quincy's expression when he unwrapped it was something Flora knew she would remember all her life, surprise giving way to deep emotion as he traced the stitching with gentle fingers. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice rough, "the most meaningful gift I've ever received." The winter passed in a flurry of preparations for the spring wedding, for the new school Quincy proposed to build, and for the everyday work of keeping the ranch running through the harsh Montana winter. There were challenges: a blizzard in January that lasted 3 days and nights, forcing the ranch hands to stay in the bunkhouse rather than their cabins, a bout of illness that swept through the children in February, keeping Flora busy nursing them alongside their worried parents, and the constant vigilance required to protect the cattle from the cold and predators. Through it all, Flora and Quincy's partnership deepened. They worked together, planning and problem-solving, each bringing their own strengths to the challenges they faced. In the evenings, they often retired to their cabin, spending a few hours alone together before returning to the main house for the night, honoring Mrs. Whitaker's insistence on propriety until the wedding. March brought the first signs of spring, the snow beginning to melt, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months, birds returning from their winter migrations, and the birth of the first calves of the season, tiny creatures wobbling on spindly legs beside their watchful mothers. With the improved weather came an increase in correspondence as wedding plans progressed. Flora received a letter from her parents, announcing their intention to attend the ceremony, despite their initial reservations about her hasty decision. Their tone was cautious but not disapproving, which Flora considered a victory in itself. Quincy's mother wrote more warmly, expressing her delight at her son's happiness and her eagerness to meet the woman who had accomplished what I thought impossible, convincing my wandering boy to put down roots. Mrs. Turner also mentioned that she would be bringing a substantial wedding gift, the deed to the building that had housed Turner Banking and Trust, which she had held onto after Quincy sold the business. She says I should consider it a Western branch of the family legacy, Quincy told Flora, looking bemused as he read the letter. Though what we'd do with a bank building in St. Louis, I can't imagine. Perhaps it could be sold and the funds used for the school? Flora suggested, practical as always. Quincy smiled, drawing her into his arms. Always thinking of others. That's one of the many reasons I love you, Flora Redwood. Soon to be Flora Turner, she reminded him, a thrill running through her at the thought. The best decision I ever made, he murmured, bending to kiss her. Asking you to take my name. As April arrived, bringing with it warmer weather and wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows, the final wedding preparations were set in motion. The ceremony would take place on the ranch, with a local judge officiating and guests from both near and far in attendance. The main house and outbuildings were cleaned and polished until they gleamed, and the garden, under Mrs. Whitaker's direction, was prepared for its early blooms. Mrs. Turner arrived a week before the wedding, an elegant woman in her 60s, whose resemblance to Quincy was evident in her green eyes and the set of her jaw. She embraced Flora warmly upon meeting her, then held her at arm's length for inspection. "Well, Quincy," she declared after a moment, "you've done better than I could have hoped. This young woman has intelligence in her eyes and strength in her bearing. I approve entirely." Flora, who had been nervous about meeting her future mother-in-law, felt herself relax at this straightforward assessment. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I'm very pleased to meet you at last. Quincy speaks of you with great respect." "Does he?" Mrs. Turner arched an eyebrow at her son. "That's more than I expected, given our disagreements over the years." Her expression softened. "But perhaps that's the influence of love. It has a way of healing old wounds." In the days that followed, Flora found herself genuinely liking Quincy's mother. Beneath her formal exterior was a sharp mind and a dry wit that reminded her very much of her future husband. Mrs. Turner took a keen interest in the ranch operations and in Flora's teaching methods, asking insightful questions and offering occasionally unorthodox suggestions. "She's not at all what I expected," Flora confided to Quincy one evening as they walked back from their cabin to the main house. "From the way you spoke of your parents, I imagined someone more conventional." Quincy chuckled. "Mother has always been the progressive one, in her way. She was my father's equal partner in all but name-keeping the books, advising on investments, managing the household with military precision. What she wanted for me wasn't so much conventionality as security." "And now? Does she think you found it?" He glanced down at her, his eyes warm in the fading light. "I believe she does. She told me yesterday that she's never seen me so settled, so purposeful." He squeezed her hand. "That's your doing, Flora." "Ours," she corrected gently. "What we've built together." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and early flowers. Flora woke in her room in the East Wing for the last time, knowing that after today, she would move permanently to the cabin she and Quincy had begun to call the homestead. Mrs. Whitaker and Mrs. Turner helped her dress in the gown they had worked on together, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant, like Flora herself. Her hair was arranged in a coronet of braids, with sprigs of wildflowers woven through it instead of a veil. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Turner said, her eyes suspiciously bright as she fastened a strand of pearls around Flora's neck. Her wedding gift? passed down through generations of Turner women. "Those are happy tears," she assured Flora, noticing her concerned expression. "I'm just so pleased to see Quincy finding the happiness he deserves, with a woman worthy of him." The ceremony took place in the garden, where early tulips and daffodils provided natural decoration. A path had been created between rows of chairs, leading to an arch covered with evergreen boughs and more spring flowers, where the judge waited with Quincy at his side. As Flora walked down this path on the arm of Judge Hawkins, who had happily agreed to give her away in her father's absence, as her parents' stage had been delayed by spring flooding, she had eyes only for Quincy. He stood tall and straight in a new suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed, his face alight with love and pride as he watched her approach. The ceremony itself was simple, but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves, speaking of partnership, respect, and enduring love. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Quincy bent to kiss her with tender reverence, Flora felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration that followed was joyous and relaxed, with tables set up in the garden and food prepared by Mrs. Chen and helpers from town. There was music provided by several ranch hands who played fiddle and guitar, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Flora's parents arrived just as the feast was beginning, full of apologies for their delayed journey and obvious curiosity about the man their daughter had chosen. Professor Redwood, a scholarly man with kind eyes, seemed particularly interested in Quincy's library and his views on education, while Mrs. Redwood, after initial reserve, was won over by the evident happiness of her daughter and the warm welcome extended by Mrs. Turner. "Your young man is not what I expected," Flora's mother confided as they watched Quincy dancing with one of the ranch children, who stood on his boots to reach the proper height. "When you wrote about a cowboy rancher, I imagined someone rather different." "Quincy defies easy categorization," Flora replied with a smile. "He's a businessman with the soul of a poet, a leader who isn't afraid to learn from others, a man of action who values thoughtfulness. He's everything I never knew I was looking for." Mrs. Redwood studied her daughter's face, then nodded slowly. "I see that now. And I see how happy you are, Flora. Happier than I've ever seen you." She squeezed Flora's hand. "Your father and I, we only ever wanted what was best for you. We thought we knew what that was, but perhaps you knew better all along." It was as close to an apology as Flora had ever received from her proud mother, and she treasured it, leaning over to kiss the older woman's cheek. "Thank you for coming, Mother. It means a great deal to have you here." As the celebration continued, Flora found moments to speak with each of their guests, the townsfolk from Willow Creek, including the widow Simmons who had given her shelter that first night, the ranch hands and their families who had become her extended family, Wallace and his wife, who had traveled from their new home on a neighboring ranch to share in the day, and even Mr. Hollister from the boarding house, who had been invited at Quincy's insistence, and who seemed genuinely pleased to see how well things had turned out for the young woman he had once pursued for unpaid rent. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Quincy found Flora speaking with Mrs. Whitaker near the refreshment table. He slipped an arm around her waist, bending to whisper in her ear, "Ready to make our escape, Mrs. Turner?" The name sent a thrill through her, still new and wonderful. "If you think we can get away without causing offense," she whispered back. Mrs. Whitaker snorted. "Go on, you two. Everyone's had enough food and drink to keep them happy for hours yet, and they all know what day it is." Her stern expression softened. "Be happy, my dears. You deserve it." With that blessing, Quincy and Flora made their way through the gathering, accepting congratulations and well wishes, until they reached the edge of the garden where two horses waited, Thunderbolt and Daisy, both groomed to gleaming and decorated with ribbons for the occasion. "I thought we might ride to the homestead," Quincy explained, helping Flora gather her skirts so she could mount side saddle. Our first journey as husband and wife. The ride through the spring evening was magical, with the last light fading from the sky and the first stars beginning to appear. Flora felt a profound sense of peace and rightness as they approached the cabin, their home where lamps had been lit in the windows and smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth within. Quincy dismounted first, then came to lift Flora down from her horse. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the door with a smile that made her heart race. "Welcome home, Mrs. Turner," he said, pushing the door open with his shoulder and carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Fresh flowers stood in vases on every surface, the fire burned merrily in the hearth, and the bed in the adjoining room was turned down, inviting and intimate. "When did you do all this?" Flora asked as Quincy set her gently on her feet. "I had some help," he admitted. "Wallace's wife slipped away during the dancing to make sure everything was ready for us." He took her hands in his expression growing serious. "Are you happy, Flora? Truly." She reached up to touch his face, her heart in her eyes. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. You've given me everything I was searching for. Quincy, a purpose, a home, a partnership." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "And love. So much love." His arms went around her, drawing her close as the kiss deepened, filled with promise and passion too long restrained. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I still remember the first time I saw you," he murmured, "standing in the shadows, so proud despite your circumstances. I thought then that you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But I had no idea how remarkable you truly were. And I thought you were too good to be true," Flora replied, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "A handsome cowboy appearing out of nowhere to rescue me? It seemed impossible." "Not impossible," Quincy corrected, his green eyes darkening with emotion. "Destined, perhaps. As if all our choices, all our journeys, were leading us to that moment, to each other." Flora smiled, remembering her despair that day, how certain she had been that all was lost. "I thought I was hopeless," she whispered. Quincy's answering smile was tender as he echoed the words he had spoken on that hilltop months ago, words that had changed everything. "But you weren't. You were never hopeless, Flora. You were just waiting for the right place, the right time, the right person." "And I found them all," she said, her heart so full it felt it might overflow. "I found you." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky, Quincy Turner held his bride close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From St. Louis to California, to this remote valley, from banker's son to cowboy to rancher, from solitude to partnership to love. And Flora, in his arms, thought of her own journey from Boston society to frontier schoolteacher, from dependence to independence to interdependence, from hopelessness to a future bright with promise. They had found in each other not just love, but hope. Hope for themselves, for the children they taught, for the community they were building, for the life they would share. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all. 5 years later, Flora Turner stood on the porch of the homestead, watching as a small figure on horseback made its way up the path from the main ranch house. Her hand rested automatically on her swollen belly, where her third child, another girl, she suspected, though Quincy was convinced it would be a boy this time, kicked vigorously against her palm. Inside the cabin, their 4-year-old daughter, Eleanor, was taking her afternoon nap, while 2-year-old James played quietly at Flora's feet, stacking wooden blocks his father had carved for him. The spring day was warm and bright, with wildflowers dotting the meadows and the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains. As the rider drew nearer, Flora recognized her husband's tall form and broad shoulders. He dismounted in one fluid motion that still made her heart skip, even after 5 years of marriage, and led Thunderbolt to the small stable adjacent to the cabin. When he emerged, his face broke into a smile at the sight of his family waiting for him. "There's my beautiful wife," he called, striding toward them. "And my little builder." He scooped James up, tossing him gently in the air to the boy's squealing delight, then bent to kiss Flora, his hand coming to rest alongside hers on her rounded belly. "How are you feeling today?" "Wonderful," Flora assured him, leaning into his solid warmth. "The baby's been active, but otherwise, I'm well." "How was the school board meeting?" Quincy's expression brightened further. "Productive. They've approved the expansion 2 new classrooms and another teacher. Willow Creek School will soon be the largest in the county." Pride filled Flora's heart at this news. The small schoolhouse they had built near town had grown steadily over the past 5 years, serving not only the children of Turner Ranch, but those from surrounding farms and ranches, and even from Willow Creek itself. Flora had served as headmistress until her second pregnancy, when she had reduced her involvement to curriculum planning and occasional guest teaching, but her vision continued to shape the school's development. "That's wonderful news," she said, slipping her arm through his as they moved into the cabin. "Who will they hire for the new position?" "The board favors Mei Chen," Quincy replied, setting James down to resume his block building. "She's done remarkably well at that teacher's college in Denver, and her letters indicate she's eager to return home." Flora smiled at the thought of her former pupil, now a young woman of 17, completing her education and returning to help educate the next generation. "She'll be wonderful." She always had a gift for explaining complex ideas clearly. "Like her teacher," Quincy said, his eyes warm with affection. They moved to the kitchen, where Flora began preparing tea, while Quincy retrieved Eleanor, who had awakened from her nap and was calling for her papa. The little girl, with Flora's auburn hair and Quincy's green eyes, snuggled contentedly in her father's arms as he told her about the new foal born that morning in the stables. As Flora watched them, a wave of gratitude swept over her for the life they had built together. Turner Ranch had prospered beyond their expectations, expanding to include neighboring properties and employing dozens of workers, many of whom had built homes and raised families on the land. The school flourished, providing education to children who might otherwise have had limited opportunities. And their own family grew, filled with love and purpose and hope. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Flora and Quincy sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, his free hand splayed protectively over her belly where their unborn child rested. "Do you ever think about that day we met?" Quincy asked, his voice a rumble she could feel against her cheek. "How different our lives might have been if I hadn't happened to be in town that afternoon, or if you had gone somewhere else to hide from Hollister." Flora considered this, remembering the desperate young woman she had been, at the end of her resources and hope. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then, I think perhaps it wasn't chance at all. Perhaps we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." Quincy's arm tightened around her. "I like that idea," he said softly. "That no matter what choices we made, what paths we took, we would have found our way to each other, to our children, to this life we've built." Flora turned her face up to his, seeing in his beloved features the same steadfast love and quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "I was so lost that day," she murmured, "so certain that all my dreams had come to nothing. And I was a man who had everything the world could offer, except the one thing I truly needed," Quincy replied, bending to kiss her gently. "You." As the stars wheeled overhead and the night settled around them like a comfortable blanket, Flora Turner thought of all the journeys that had led to this moment, her journey west in search of independence. Quincy's journey from banker's son to rancher, their shared journey from strangers to partners to the family they had become. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of the man beside her, in the children they had created together, in the community they continued to build day by day. She had thought herself hopeless that long ago afternoon in Willow Creek. But then a cowboy had smiled at her and said, "You're my hope from this day on." And he had been right, in ways neither of them could have imagined. They had found in each other not just love, but hope enduring, resilient, ever renewing. Hope that had built a ranch, a school, a family. Hope that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. Hope that would, in time, become their most precious legacy to their children and to the community they had helped to create. As Quincy bent to kiss her once more under the star-strewn sky, Flora Turner closed her eyes and offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her home.